Hey friends, Chris Maholka here. This is the first video in my series on practical color mixing. I'm going to show you how to take inexpensive acrylic paints, blend the different primaries and secondaries together to get basically any shade you want for things like fishing lures, model airplanes and model cars, anywhere you could use acrylic paints. Now, I know a lot of my friends that do fishing lures and some that do model cars and airplanes use airbrushes. So I'm also going to show you how to use my thinner that I mixed in my last video to thin these down to use them in an airbrush. We've got lots of stuff to cover in this series, so let's get started. Sometimes beginning a new project is the most difficult thing, so I want to start you out as easy and as inexpensively as we can. If you've done any color mixing at all, you know that there are just some very basics. There is cyan, and you don't have to get these brands. This is Artist Loft, and I've got some basics. These all come from your hobby shops or craft stores. I'll also put a link on my YouTube channel on where you can get them from Amazon. But this is cyan. This one is called Cerulean Blue in Artist Loft, but it's cyan. Another Artist Loft, but this is just brilliant yellow. And a Basics, Liquitex of Basics, and this is very simply magenta. So you need magenta, yellow, and cyan. Then you need a base to mix in, so a titanium white, and then to darken things down, a black. Now these will get you basically every color there is. If we're going to do a very simple beginning mixing tutorial, we would go like this. We would go yellow and cyan mixed together, make green. Yellow and magenta together, make red. And cyan and magenta together, make blue. So you can use all your primaries to make your secondaries. So really, if you want to just keep it at a very minimal, having your primaries, your yellow, cyan, and magenta, and your black and white are all you need to get started. I've seen on Facebook pages where they say, oh, to paint spinner baits or to paint crankbaits, you need to spend $400 in paint. You can get by on about $40 worth of paint and do the same job, and just takes a little bit more effort because you have to thin things, and I'm going to show you how to do that using my thinner. But these are the basic paints you need. Next, you need something to mix on, and what you need is a piece of glass and some kind of a mixing stick, whatever. Now, if you look closely at these, I've got these laying on a white paper towel. This is something that can really mess people up when they're trying to mix colors. This is a piece of glass from a picture frame, and when you look at it laying on the white compared to a piece of stained glass, clear stained glass, you can see this has a green tint to it. So if you're going to mix something on this piece of plain glass, getting that little bit of green tint on or out of your paint may be a little bit of an issue. I would recommend hitting Hobby Lobby or somewhere and getting a partial sheet of clear stained glass to mix on. It has to be smooth on one side. This has a little bit of a ripple on the back, but that doesn't matter. And then take a little bit of sandpaper and sand the edges of your glass so it's not sharp. This is going to be where we mix all of our paint, and we want to have it clear so when we lay it on a color, we can see through the glass and see the color we're trying to match. So if we're trying to match something like, for instance, an orange for a crayfish pattern, I can lay that color right under my glass, and I can see then when I'm mixing the shade of my wannabe compared to what I'm mixing and make adjustments to the color. A couple additional items you'll want to have on hand are some kind of a container, because when you get a good color mix, you're going to want to save it, and you also need something to thin your paint down in. So I've gone to the dollar store, and you can get like these little Tupperware containers, 4 for $1. Now these are they're kind of hard to find sometimes. These can be in travel supplies as well as food, because people need things to put their medicines and different things in when they travel. So you can find these a lot of times in travel or homekeeping, as well as just where Tupperware is. Or if you like the little bottles like this, also from the dollar store, these are a travel kit to take your shampoo and things with you in. So these are in a different part of the store than these. These are in travel accessories. So that gives you a couple ways that you can store your paint once you've mixed a color, and also thin it so you have it on hand for more than just one time. And then something that will save your sanity is a notepad and a pen, because you want to, as you mix this paint, you want to write down what you're doing, because if you get a really good color that looks good on whatever you're doing, you want to be able to repeat it. And if you don't write it down, sometimes it can be more difficult, because you may have put a little something in there you hadn't planned on that gets just the right effect, and if you don't have it written down, next time you may not remember what that is. So always write down and document everything you do to keep on hand. In addition to being able to mix your colors, when you get ready to mix, you want to have a color reference sample of some kind. Now, in the start there, I showed you about the orange, putting it underneath your mixing glass. Sometimes when you get inspiration, it'll be in the strangest places, like you'd be at the paint store or a hardware store. If you want to mix something that's a particular color, it's best to have a reference for it. So here I have a basic orange, and if I was going to put a paint on a crankbait for a crawdad, for instance, you might want to do the belly or the lower part a yellowish color, the middle an orange, and the top part more of a fiery orange, and more of a red orange. So having a reference sample for whatever color you're painting is always a good thing to do. It shows you where you need to be or what you're after, because paint mixing is very subjective. One person's eye can see different shades, different colors differently. For instance, I've seen a lot of people on one of the sites I'm on talk about mixing a paint color called Old Bone. They want to match an Old Bone look on their lure. Two antlers that I've got here, which are basically about as old a bone as you get. This one is more of a neutral color, and this one is fairly easy to mix. This one, if you can see it, has a bluish tint to it. So it's like if you're mixing Old Bone, exactly what is the Old Bone you're trying to match. If it's just a beef bone or a dog bone, bring it in, set it on your table, and look at it. I'm going to use this to show you how to mix an Old Bone color in this video. So here's your first basic lesson in color mixing. The basics of it are, it's always easier to start with a lighter color and mix darker into it. You start as a lighter base. Say for instance, this piece you see right here is a nice shade of red overall. I'm just using this as an example. Say it's something like red, like that. This is the shade you've got right here. Now suppose you don't want this much red. You want it to be 50% lighter. If you do that, you're going to have to add white to it, or a lighter shade, and it's going to have to be a lot of the white. So now you've added a bunch of white, but maybe it's still darker than you really want, so you have to add more white. So you add more white, and then that breaks the red down into a lighter shade. Now all of a sudden you've got 4 times the volume of paint you really may need to do the job. So it's far easier when you're mixing colors to start with a white base and add a touch of red till you get the shade. If you want it darker, you can add a little more red to it, but you haven't had to increase the white at all. So you've saved yourself some money. So the basics is always start lighter and mix darker, and that applies in almost everything. There are special examples or special cases where you'll want to just lighten up a dark color, but that's more rare. You'll usually want to start with a lighter base and go from there. Okay, so let's get to actually mixing some paint here. Now, as I told you, I see a lot of people asking about Old Bone. So we're going to mix first to this warmer color antler, and then I'll show you how to actually take it and tone it down to match this bluer shade on top after we get the basic mixed. So the bone is not actually a strong color. It's actually just an off-white, but it's a warm shade of off-white. So we're going to mix some white as our base, and to keep it warm, it's kind of a very, very pale reddish orange. We're going to mix a little magenta and yellow together in the white. to get that shade, that warm shade, but off-white. So we're going to start with the glob of white. This is going to be our base. And also, I forgot to mention, I use a lot of paper towels when I'm mixing, because especially if you're mixing for an airbrush, you don't want any small crusty parts to be on that to go into your paint, because it will, clog up your brush. So you want to make sure that you keep that clean before you squirt your paint out. So there's our white. Then we're going to add just a touch of yellow, and I'm actually using matchsticks for this, but anything works. You want to use a different one for each color so you don't contaminate the top of your container. So I'm just going to take just a tiny touch of yellow, and this is just, barely any on the matchstick, and put it in our white. I'm going to do the same then with the magenta. And this is one that you can see that the top has got some buildup on it that's dried, so we're just going to remove that with a paper towel. That way it doesn't transfer into our mix. There we go, nice and clean. And just a little bit of that on the matchstick into our mix. Then when I start mixing this, I don't want to put my mixing stick into the colors I've added. I want to put it into the base, because I don't want any of those sticking too much and wasting any extra color on the stick. We want to just keep it all in the blend, because we've used so little of it. So as we stir, you start to see it swirl around in there. And it may be just this particular one, a little bit stronger magenta. It's a little bit warmer than we would like, but not terribly bad. With the flat glass, you can scrape. You can see there's little bits of yellow and red, or yellow and magenta that haven't been mixed in yet. And we'll scrape back and forth, and we'll get that blended. I'm going to add just a tiny bit more yellow to this. Again, just a little bit. And that's coming around very nicely. Off-white, so it's not as bright as the pure white. It's got the shade of the warmth of the natural antler, and looks very much like an old bone shade. And when you want to compare, if you're comparing colors, you don't necessarily want to do it when the color is wet, because you're going to be viewing everything on it, on whatever you're painting, dry. So you can actually take a little bit of that color and put it on another piece of glass or a paper towel and dry it with a hairdryer to compare. If you're using something that isn't really critical, you could act like this antler is. You put a touch of it on the antler and look. Still a little bit lighter, but not terribly bad. We're gonna wipe that off, and if I was being critical, I would go and dry that right on the antler and see how it looks. And you can always begin to remove it with like an X-Acto knife or something by just scraping lightly on it. So this is now basically the shade of the warm colored antler. This is a very decent looking old bone color right here. Now if we wanted to take it down to the shade of this bluer antler, it's a cooler color. So out of the three that we've got, our yellow, our magenta, and our cyan, the cyan is obviously the cooler color of the two. So if I'm going to take this down to a little bit cooler shade, I'll just add a very small amount of cyan to it. Just a tiny bit, doesn't take much. And we'll blend that, and you'll see it kind of gray up, because if you mixed yellow, cyan, and magenta all together in equal portions, you'd pretty much get gray. If they were dark enough tinted, you'd get black, because they are the three basic primers that there are that make up everything. And if they're mixed in equal colors, equal amounts, they produce a neutral, which would be gray or black. So now we've cooled that color down from our warm bone color to a lot closer to our blue shade. I could actually add just a touch more of the cyan to it, because it's still just a tiny bit warmer than I would like if I was matching that antler exactly. And again, make sure we scrape and get everything blended together so it's all even. Now all I would do is, if I was thinking about using this as my color for an antler match, I would just take a dab of that, put it on the antler, and go and dry it. And it still is a little bit warm, a little bit light, so maybe a little bit more cyan to it. But that's the basics of color mixing and color matching. Now, if you're going to use this in your airbrush, you obviously have to thin it. So I'm going to take one of my little Tupperware containers, and I'm just going to scrape up this paint and put it in the container. In most paints, you have to thin 50 to 75% for an airbrush. And I would recommend always thinning your paint in a container, not in the airbrush. I've watched videos where people take and put the paint right in the cup of the airbrush, put their finger over the end, and let the bubbles circulate in the cup. But when you do that, it also forces the paint back up the needle of the airbrush and can really gum up your airbrush. So 50 to 75% thinner, our homemade thinner there. Put the cap on it tight and shake it. Now when you're thinning anything like this, I always like to shake it and let it rest for a couple minutes so the paint and the thinner are all the same temperature. And that'll make it blend together better. But once you get that mixed, thinned out, it's ready to go to your airbrush. And in this case, there's our color for our cool shade of natural antler. So that's how you mix for an airbrush, or mix paint in general, but thinned for an airbrush. Join me in my next video. I'm going to show you how to make a nice baitfish blue color, kind of a pogey or bluegill green, and also I'll show you how to do the range of colors for the orange for the crayfish. Thanks for watching.